And they started talking with him about building a Trump Tower in Moscow. I asked Yuri Shvets, how do you recruit an agent? What is it you do? And he says, you're friendly to them. You figure out what they want and you give it to them. You make them happy. You're nice to them. You flatter them. You want someone who is susceptible to flattery. You want one who is susceptible to pretty young women. You want someone who's susceptible to a lot of money. And all of that, of course, seems to describe Donald Trump to a T.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome my colleague, Craig Unger, the author of several books revealing a world that I lived in, we all lived in the 20th century, the Cold War. But this is fun because it connects it to today, to a man named Donald Trump. We begin with David Bogatin. The year is 1984. David Bogatin is a mobster, but a special kind, and he's really rich for a reason known as the Red Daisy gas scam. If this sounds like Hollywood, they're not this good. Craig, a very good evening to you. Who was David Bogatin and where did he get all that money? What was the Red Daisy scam of 1984 and before? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Well, David Bogatin was a member of the Russian mafia. He was tied to Semyon Mogilevich, who is known as the Brainy Don, a multi-billionaire who is considered a genius when it came to, especially when it came to laundering money. And one of the scams they used in New York, there was a huge influx of the Russian mafia during the 80s. And the Red Daisy gas tax scam was a scam by which the Russian mafia would buy up gas stations. And, you know, if you go to the pump and buy gasoline, you are paying taxes every time you do that. But the tax man didn't come along to collect taxes till the end of the year. So the Russian mob set up a scam with dozens and dozens of phony companies where they would transfer ownership just before the tax man came. And that way they didn't have to pay tax. The new company would say, oh, that was the previous owner. And they did this all over New York. It spread all over the country. They made billions of dollars of that. And one of the beneficiaries was David Bogatin.
This is from Craig's book, American Compromise. The new book is Den of Spies, which is about another romantic tale having to do with the crisis of Jimmy Carter's administration and what was known as the October surprise. But now we're going to 1984, and we're talking about the Russian mob working with the Italian mob. How so, Craig?
Well, the Italian mob was on the downswing, but the Russian mob needed enforcement, and they made a deal, and I believe the Italian mafia got 25%. I'm not 100% sure of that, but they worked together on this, and they both came out making loads and loads of money. And one of the problems was the Russians needed to launder their money, and they needed to figure out a way to do that. And one of the best ways to launder money is through real estate. That is, it's a very unregulated industry. Tax regulations and financial disclosure regulations for real estate transactions are virtually nil. And they use this, and they wanted a place, they wanted a guy who could sell them a lot of condos that cost a lot of money. And once they did that, they could launder the money.
I'm walking down Fifth Avenue. I'm looking around. It's 1984. What do I see?
Well, if you went by 721 Fifth Avenue, you would look up and see Trump Tower, which, of course, was the crown jewel of Trump's empire. It opened, I believe, in 1983, just in time. So it was dazzling to these Russians. The gaudiness of it really appeals very much to the sensibility of Russian mobsters. But it was also a wonderful refuge through which they could launder money. And a man named Donald Trump allegedly approached David Bogatin. Bogatin came to Trump Tower. This is in 1984, and he had 6 million in cash. It's 1984 when 6 million, that would be worth about $30 million today. And he said, I'll take five condos, that is. He didn't really need five homes, but that's what he got. And he allegedly was running a prostitution ring out of some of those apartments. But whatever he got, he ended up laundering the money because Donald Trump, who was selling the condos, apparently did not bother to ask, how did you make all that money, David? Did it come from illicit enterprises like sex trafficking? And to prosecute Trump, you would have to prove his state of mind that he had knowledge of that.
I want to go to Bogatin and his thinking. Is this normal to buy 5 apartments in a very expensive condo? Or did this stand out in 84?
Well, I think it did stand out in 84. As I understand it, there were only 2 buildings in the New York area that allowed buyers to buy condos through anonymous names. That is, if you set up limited liability corporations in the Cayman Islands or wherever, that's how you do it. And Trump Tower did that, and certainly Donald Trump did it. And my understanding was he invited Bogatin to Trump Tower to do this transaction.
So the 5 apartments are sold. Bogatin pays $6 million cash. It's successfully laundered. And it's 1984. Is Bogatin also KGB, or is he just a mobster?
Well, I don't think there's any real difference. And the interesting thing with the Russian mafia, it's very different from what we have in the United States. And anyone who's ever seen The Godfather or almost any crime show knows that the Italian mafia has always been at war with the FBI. They are enemies. But it's quite different in Russia, where the Russian mafia is very much the enforcement arm of Russian intelligence. That was true during the Soviet days with the KGB, and it's true now with the FSB, which has replaced it. So what's quite interesting to me about this is I eventually found 13 people, this is who, according to FBI files, were tied to the Russian mafia in one way or another, who bought multiple apartments in Trump Towers or other Trump properties. And when you think about it, wait a minute, this is the enforcement arm of the KGB, and they're residing in the home of the man who is now president of the United States. Is that not a grave breach of national security? I think it is.
The concern in 1984 for Russian mob, did it exist? I mean, the FBI is supposed to be out there worried about Soviet penetration agents. Were they on the case at all? Did anybody overhear something or buy information to say we've got the KGB working on Fifth Avenue?
Well, the failure of the FBI is a very interesting story, and I think it's a book in itself. But I can't explain all of it, but I think it's worth noting that 2 directors of the FBI, first William Sessions and later Louis Freeh, when they retired from the FBI, they became lawyers representing the Russian mafia. And in fact, William Sessions became a lawyer representing Semyon Mogilevich, one of the top bosses in the Russian mafia. Louis Freeh represented Prevozon, who, if you understand the Magnitsky Law, was and William Browder's fight with Russia and how they seized the money he had in Prevozon, that in both cases you have directors of the FBI who are working for the Russian mafia. I mean, to me, that's quite extraordinary.
And this is, I think, Bill Casey's still alive in 84, and he's the head of the CIA. No connection to the CIA, no provocateurs, nobody picking up something overseas saying that there's an operation on Fifth Avenue?
No, I've interviewed a lot of CIA people, or at least three or four who were in Moscow, and it's just striking to me they sort of maybe they're being enormously discreet, but they were not paying attention. If I may go back to the FBI for another thing, for a moment, James. Forgive me, I'm looking at the head of the New York office of the FBI was very, very close to Trump. And I think Trump made a practice of keeping the FBI close so they wouldn't be looking into him so carefully.
I'm John Batchelor with my colleague Craig Unger, who has been investigating linkage between the KGB, the Russian mob, Fifth Avenue, and money laundering, and the now President of the United States, former President, now President of the United States, through the 1980s. We begin with the spectacular purchase of 200 TV sets from a KGB front, I believe in Brooklyn. Maybe it was Coney Island.
And this was actually in Fifth Avenue near the Flatiron Building.
All right, yes, it was in Manhattan. Those TV sets went into the Grand Hyatt, refurbished by a young developer named Donald Trump. We've now told the story of how from there we got to David Bogatin of the Russian mob laundering money that was gained illicitly in the Red Daisy scam. But now we go to Moscow itself. This is Donald Trump's first trip to Moscow. Who's your source on this, and where did he come from?
Right. Well, one of my big sources is a former major in the KGB named Yuri Shvets. And he was in the KGB in the 1980s, and he was in Washington Station, where he was recruiting spies to spy for the Soviet Union against the United States. He was recruiting Americans to do that. Meanwhile, he had colleagues in New York Station who were doing exactly the same thing, and their target was a man named Donald Trump.
And when KGB makes you a target, how do they do it? Because Trump is a developer. He's out in public all the time. How would they design such an approach?
Well, the first approach, and I said this a bit, came through Semyon Kislin, who was what known as a spotter agent. That is, his role is to spot new assets or agents who might be recruited to the KGB. And he did it by offering Donald Trump some cheap TV sets, and Trump bought it. And suddenly that was the first connection to anyone who was tied to the KGB. From that, there were, we don't know exactly, but there were people in the United Nations, and we go back to New York Station. At that time, the KGB had a lot of agents who were at the United Nations, especially in the library of the General Assembly at the UN. It was infested with Soviet agents. So some of them eventually reached out to Donald Trump, and we know they had lunch together in 1986. This was the ambassador to the from the Soviet Union to the United Nations and later to the United States. His name was Oleg Dubinin. He was ambassador first to the United Nations and later the United States. His daughter was Natalia Dubinina, and they met with Donald Trump. There are various contradictory stories about how exactly they met. Trump writes about it through a ghostwriter in The Art of the Deal, and he gives one account. Natalia Dubinina wrote her own account and gave it to the Russian press. And she has various details that are contradictory as well. But according to my source, Yuri Shvets, Natalia Dubinina, who was quite young back then, was in the UN library and was apparently one of these spies who was working for the KGB, though she was with the Soviet delegation to the UN.
You talked to a former CIA station chief in Moscow, Rolf Mowatt-Larssen. Did he confirm that Trump was approached and for recruiting by the KGB?
He confirmed all the procedures, and one of the interesting things is that once they reached out to him and they had a lunch in which they flattered him, and I want you to consider, remember, this was the height of the Cold War, and even though Gorbachev was in and was a very sort of a genial man who seemed to be fostering the thaw of the Cold War. At the time, the KGB was running hundreds and hundreds of spies in New York. And so when they reached out to Trump to say that they were still very much communists, and the idea that they would want a gaudy monument to capitalism right on Red Square was kind of absurd beyond belief. But Donald Trump believed it, and he started meeting with them, and they started talking with him about building a Trump Tower in Moscow, and it eventually led to them making a trip to Moscow. And Rolf Mowatt-Larssen told me the procedures that happened, as did Yuri Shvets, and you get a sense of, first there's one meeting, then there's another, then there's a reason for a dinner prize, you become friendly. I asked Yuri Shvets, how do you recruit an agent? What is it you do? And he says, you're friendly to them. You figure out what they want and you give it to them. You make them happy. You're nice to them. You flatter them. You want someone who is susceptible to flattery. You want one who is susceptible to pretty young women. You want someone who's susceptible to a lot of money. And all of that, of course, seems to describe Donald Trump to a T.
The interview given by Natalia the day after the victory in 2016, did she tell this long story at that time, or has that developed since then by your conversations with her?
Well, it's developed. You know, what's really interesting is she gave the day Donald Trump was elected, I think it was November 6th. I may have the date of the month wrong.
November 8th, 2016.
November 8th, 2016. She gave an interview with a Russian publication, and she gave what was essentially the origin story of how the Russians first contacted Donald Trump. And it was false. It was full of contradictions. But she made it seem as if her father was the only one, the first one to reach out to him. And that would have been somewhat legitimate during that era, because her father was not in the KGB. But but at the time, normal Soviet officials in the United States did not walk the streets alone. They were jealously guarded by their other officials to make sure they did not speak. If you were ambassador to the UN or the United States, you knew a lot of secrets, and the Soviet Union wanted to make sure you were not sharing them. And if you had any idle conversations with other Americans that were not being supervised, you would be sent back to the Soviet Union and lose your job, and much, much worse. So they were not running about wildly with impromptu meetings, as Natalia Dubanin said they were.
All right, it's 1986. We have a minute left. 1986. The Trump Tower is developing in Moscow, or was it dashed that first visit? We have a minute.
No, it wasn't dashed. This is when the invitation comes, and I believe it's not till 1987 that he gets there. It's July 4th that he's invited to come there, and that's obviously symbolic to the KGB because they're taking you away from being in the U.S. on our Independence Day.
So the hook was, we might build a Trump Tower. That was the hook to get to Moscow.
Absolutely.
Craig Unger, the new book is Den of Spies. It is about the October surprise of 1980 and the Reagan administration and Bill Casey. But these are books, American Compromat and others that Craig has published before. We'll leave it at 1986, 87 and come back to this. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.